was raised over in Little John Island back in Maine. Little John is a small community of about 100 people, just off the coast near Yarmouth. Technically speaking, it's long been incorporated into Yarmouth Township, and all the island kids bus across the bridges to the high schools there, but try telling that to the islanders. We never say we're from Yarmouth when people ask where we're from. We answer, Little John, every time. Maybe it's the fact that we're cut off by the ocean. Maybe it's just the people who live there, but there's a strong sense of togetherness and independence on Little John. Kind of like a siege mentality, only without the siege. As I said, the island kids used to catch the bus across both the Talbot Road and the Sandy Point bridges in order to get to school, which included me. It just so happened that my favorite teacher, Coach Collins, was also an islander, and he was my favorite teacher for two reasons. Not only did he teach history and coach the senior ice hockey team, but he was just an all-around nice guy too, and used to give me a ride home after practice, since walking home during a Maine winter night can sometimes be downright dangerous. Coach Collins was the kind of guy that kids like me really looked up to. He almost turned pro after playing hockey in college, won a Bronze Star in Vietnam, and unlike many of his colleagues, had a way of talking to his students that made you feel like he was your cool uncle or something. He was the best. No one had a bad word to say about him, and for a long, long time, Coach Collins occupied some mythical status in the town's collective consciousness. So it's March 7th, 1989. I remember the exact date because Dino Ciccarelli was traded from the Minnesota North Stars to the Washington Capitals. He was the outlaw hockey player for a while, a complete jerk, but God, could he shoot a puck? And it was all we talked about at practice that night. Then, in the middle of practice, I look up to see my girlfriend's best friend Kelly standing at the edge of the ice. She starts calling me over, and when I get a chance, I skate over to see what she wants. Kelly tells me that my girlfriend wanted me to call her as soon as I got home, and from the way Kelly was acting, I knew it wasn't going to be good news. Consequently, I'm totally distracted for the rest of practice. My shooting sucks, and I'm in a stinker of a mood by the time it comes for Coach Collins to give me a ride home like usual. He does his regular approachable patriarch routine. We talk, he dishes out some wholesome advice, and suddenly, I'm not catastrophizing so much anymore. I thank him, go inside, call out my girlfriend, and what do you know? She wants to break up. Coach's advice sort of stopped me from having a full-blown teenage heartbreak moment, but I was still upset. Only I couldn't just sit around eating ice cream and feeling sorry for myself. I was masculine upset. I was troubled, so to speak. I figured I'd steal one of my dad's beers and go for a walk in the woods, maybe stand out on Madeline Point looking all broody and such. So, that's exactly what I did. Looking back on it, it was just puppy love, no big deal. But as I said, it bruised my ego enough to feel like heartbreak, and that's all that mattered, I suppose. Either way, I found myself wishing I could talk to Coach Collins about it again. A guy like that had seen and experienced so much, and he'd still managed to come home and start a happy, functional family. He'd know what to say. He'd know what it was I had to do. I'm almost at Madeline Point, and I'm right where there's a kind of fork in the dirt road. One way leads to the water, the other is the overgrown driveway of a long abandoned house. Now the sun hasn't quite set by that time, and there's still a little bit of that blue twilight in the sky, and it gives the rotting old structure this awesomely creepy vibe. So creepy in fact that I almost soiled my pants when I heard some car horn let out this short, sharp honk from somewhere real close by. I had no idea anyone else was around. The whole point of walking out that far towards Madeline Point was so I could be on my own, and since the place was normally deserted during the drizzly Maine springtime, I was kind of spooked that anyone was there at all. But by that point, I'm a little buzzed and naturally curious, so I start cautiously padding off down the overgrown driveway, trying to find the source of the honk. When I finally saw the truck that seemed to be parked deliberately out of sight among the trees, I couldn't believe my eyes. Remember how I said I wished I had Coach Collins to talk to? That I could have really used some of that wholesome, cool uncle advice he always had on hand? Well, guess what? Like some miraculous act of God, whose truck should I find parked in the trees but Coach Collins? There's this weirdly comic moment at first when I'm super happy to see his truck, but I also realize I'm carrying the beer I stole from my dad. I dart back out of sight, toss the beer, then start chomping on the stick of double mint that I've been carrying to get the smell of booze off my breath. I'm just about to come back around the trees for a second time when the passenger door to the coach's truck swings open. I watch as someone basically falls out of it, stumbles to their feet, then leans up against a tree and starts puking. I could tell right away it wasn't Coach Collins. It actually looked like a girl. And it was confirmed when I heard the kind of high-pitched puking sound she made. Okay, I realize that might sound weird, but guys and girls puke different. It is what it is. But anyway, I start straining my eyes to see who it is. Light is getting pretty low at that point, and without being able to see behind the mess of long hair, it was hard to tell exactly who it was. But then, I hear Coach Collins saying something from inside his truck. Only, it didn't sound like the Coach Collins I knew. "Get back in the truck, Maria." Then I realized who it was. Maria and I had chemistry together, so I'd spoken to her once or twice, and she'd been a cheerleader for the longest time until recently dropping out of the squad. Her dropping out of the squad had coincided with a decline in her GPA and an overall odd shift in her behavior. A bunch of rumors went around that ran the spectrum of patently ridiculous to sinisterly believable, but the truth had remained in the dark. Yet something was definitely having a negative effect on Maria. And there came a moment when I realized I might have just found out what that thing was. Hidden among the trees, maybe 40 or 50 feet away, I watched Maria wiping her mouth before the coach yelled something at her from the driver's seat. "Don't make me tell you again, Maria. Get back in the truck." Maria seemed to be fighting back tears, like getting back in that truck was the last thing on earth she wanted to do. Then I literally can't believe what I'm seeing as she turns, tugs up her jeans a little, then buttons them closed. I'm glad I don't have to explain the connotations of that because even all these years later, the idea still makes my skin crawl. Only as Maria turns, I must have been leaning too far out from the tree I was using for cover because there's this one horrible moment where we both just lock eyes for a second. I assume I'm busted, so I start edging away before breaking into a run back towards Cousin Street. As I'm running, I keep expecting to hear the truck revving its engine, either to follow me or take off to avoid being seen again. But nothing happens. I just run and run and run until I reach the Talbot Road bridge that led back to Littlejohn and home. Once I was home, and I'd calmed down a little, I started to wonder why I'd ran in the first place. I know it sounds horrible in retrospect. The way Coach was talking to Maria should have told me everything I needed to know. There was the lack of empathy that she was vomiting, not to mention the question why she was vomiting in the first place. But I was young, scared, and embarrassingly drunk off of one beer, so I tried to rationalize. I didn't even really see Coach Collins, and it's possible that someone else in the area owned a truck the same model as his. Sure, the voice sounded like him, but that didn't mean it was. Besides, if something shady was going on, surely Maria would have told me since she'd seen me and all. But thinking of it, had she seen me? Maybe I just imagined she had. And if they were doing something awful, why not speed off or give chase? There was a lot that I could interpret as being totally harmless, but there was a disturbing amount that indicated that what I'd seen was something very, very wrong. But then, what was I to do about it? Accuse Coach Collins, the small-town war hero, a father, a husband, the best hockey coach in the Northeast, of being a freaking predator? That was unthinkable to me. What if I accused him, and there was a perfectly reasonable explanation? I'd be a pariah. I wouldn't be able to show my face around town, let alone at hockey practice, the same hockey practice I loved and that he coached. I'm sorry to ramble. It's just, you need to understand my mindset about it, and why I kept so quiet about the whole thing for a straight week. I know it was the wrong play, and to everyone reading this, especially to Maria, I'm sorry. You just have to understand. I figured if anything was going to go down, it'd be the next day at school. Maybe Maria would confront me about spying on her or something. I had no idea. Everything was still so unclear at the time, hence my hesitance to act on it. But nothing happened. No one said anything. Coach Collins passed me in the hallway and just said, "Morning," like he normally did. I tried to act normal about it. I tried to push it all the way in the back of my mind, but I've never been very good at hiding the way I feel. I know people noticed the change in my attitude, and by the weekend, my mom was asking why I was being so quiet. I told her I was just tired, but I guess it's because the one thing I wanted to talk about was off limits. I especially couldn't act the same around Coach Collins, and it was only when I went to check out his truck after school that I got any sense of reassurance. I noticed that there was this big "Support Our Troops" sticker on his back bumper, something I didn't remember seeing on the truck in the woods that day. But as much as I tried to ignore it, the fact remained that I simply may not have noticed it at the time because, understandably, I was very much distracted by other events. But still, I kept my mouth shut, and it actually took a few more days before I actually did anything about it. The day I broke was exactly a week after the event. For 7 nights straight, all I'd thought about before I drifted off into an uneasy sleep was the possibility of Coach Collins being the voice in that truck. Of how, if he was doing something seriously evil to Maria right under the noses of everyone in town, then I had to do something about it. I wouldn't be able to live with myself otherwise. So, I decided to approach Maria. I couldn't just ask who she was with, promise to keep my mouth shut and live with the consequences. I didn't have to drop Coach Collins' name, and I could just gauge her reaction to the question. And when I looked at it like that, it all seemed so easy and simple. I mean, she'd tell me if she needed help, right? Right? And that's what I did. I caught up with Maria after chemistry one afternoon, asked if I could talk to her in private, apologized for what I was about to ask, then just hit her with it. "Who were you out with near the power station last week?" The way she looked at me at first made me think she was about to just deny it. This mocking, "you're crazy" kind of look. I cut her off with, "I know it was you. I saw you, and you saw me too. I just need to know who you were with." After that, all her bluster just melted away, and the confident ex-cheerleader began to look like a scared little girl. "No one," she said, and just walked off towards the lockers. I tried one more time to talk to her about it, but as she walked past me in the school parking lot, all she had to say to me was, "Leave me alone." That was the crushing moment when I realized that my worst fears had come true, and that nothing about little John would ever be the same for me, ever again. The trouble was, I was at something of an impasse. Even if I did tell the cops about the coach, she'd have to actually want to talk to someone about it. Otherwise, all I had was a baseless accusation that might ruin my life completely. If I was going to do anything, it needed to be well planned and delicately executed. But just what that was, I had no idea at the time. In the weeks since I saw Maria in the woods, I'd skipped hockey practice twice, and the times I showed up, I ducked Coach Collins when he asked me about my usual ride home. But that evening, when I fumbled for some excuse about going over to a friend's house to study, he said something that made my stomach tie itself into a knot. "Get in the truck." The tone was almost exactly the same as it had been in the woods previously. If there was any doubt still left in my mind, there wasn't after that. Part of me wanted to just get in the truck, to go back to pretending like I hadn't seen anything, or if I did, it was all perfectly explainable. But the other part of me, the rational part, told me that getting in Coach Collins' truck was a very, very bad idea. I told him no. Nothing else. Just one solitary no. and what followed were a few moments of silence as I saw a look come over the coach's face that I'd never seen before. He became cold, expressionless, and only later did it occur to me that what I was looking at might have been the last thing one or two Viet Cong guerrillas saw before. You know. Then he spoke. "Have you got something you want to ask me, son?" I just shook my head. "Good. Because being so close to graduating, it would be a shame if anything were to keep you from your studies, wouldn't it?" He said, and waited for a response. And I didn't say a thing in reply. "Kid like you has a lot of potential. You could enroll in some fancy college across the country, get some well-paid big city job, and just leave little John behind. Never look back. You understand me?" The horrible thing was, I did understand. I heard what he said, and I saw the appeal. But I hated him. I felt betrayed, and I wanted everyone to know he was a liar, a cheat, and a predator. So after a week of doing nothing, I finally went home and told my mom. I know it was something I should have done a week prior. It was obvious just from how tactfully she knew how to handle the situation. She drove over to Maria's house, talked to Maria's mom. In private, she was quick to add. Then the pair of them approached Maria and I don't even know, used their mom magic to just coax it out of her. By the time she got home at around 10, just 3 hours after she left, she said Maria and her mom were ready to go to the police. Only the thing is, unlike Hollywood movies, where there's usually some big resolution and everyone gets their just desserts, etc., this story doesn't have a real end to it. Coach Collins was questioned by police, but since the DA or judge or whoever didn't think there was enough evidence to push for a trial, the coach was never arrested or charged with anything. Maria, on the other hand, died in a car accident where the other driver was twice over the legal limit, just smashed into her and her sister while they were coming back from Portland one night. It was a horrific tragedy, and it meant that whatever secrets Maria had went to her grave with her. But the cherry on top is that not only was Coach Collins never punished for what he did, but he was right about me. I went into a college out in Seattle, ended up getting a job here in Oregon. Mom and Dad moved into Portland as they got older, so I've not been back to Little John in almost 20 years now. And honestly, I'd like to keep it that way. I can't stand small towns in general anymore. My wife thinks they're cutesy and kitsch, but only because she grew up in Chicago. Me, I know how small towns work. I know they all have dark secrets buried just below the surface. But unlike big cities where bad things happen all the time, people just don't see it. In small towns, people know all about the bad things, and it's not that they can't see it. They just choose not to. In northwestern Missouri, there is a small, unassuming town, much like many others that dot the highways of the central United States. Established in 1840, it is the home of St. Oswald's, one of the oldest Protestant Episcopal churches in the country. But other than that, there's not much to the place, and it would be easy to just drive through the one-stoplight town without so much as a second glance. But in actual fact, the main drag of that small Missouri town was the site of one of the most shocking and sensationalized crimes in American history, and its name is one that is now associated with a murky web of revenge, murder, lies, and intimidation. Skidmore. The crime that made Skidmore famous occurred in July of 1981, but to properly tell the town's story, we have to go all the way back to June 1st of 1934, the day when a baby boy by the name of Ken Rex McElroy was brought into the world. Ken and his 15 brothers and sisters grew up in a small, rundown house just outside of Skidmore, the son of a poor tenant farming couple named Tony and Mabel. For many years, they had traveled back and forth between the Ozarks and Kansas City, depending on where the work was. But after a while, they tired of the exhaustive wandering lifestyle and settled in Nottoway County. Ken's upbringing was troubled to say the least, and by the time he was 15, he had dropped out of the 8th grade to become a small-time thief and cattle rustler, and so began a criminal rampage that would last the better part of 20 years, with Ken allegedly dabbling in the theft of grain, gasoline, alcohol, antiques, and livestock. As a result of his criminality, Ken was arrested and charged on a whopping 21 occasions, but managed to dodge every conviction the law threw at him through a combination of shrewd practices and witness intimidation. Skidmore residents frequently complained that Ken would stalk those that sought to testify against him, parking outside their homes in a flagrant and menacing display. But Ken wasn't just a prolific criminal. He was also a prolific lech, rumored to have fathered more than 10 different children with around 4 or 5 different women. And it's this aspect of Ken's character that reveals him as not simply some small-town rascal with sticky fingers, but a deeply wicked and monstrous predator. Because horrifyingly, when Ken met his wife, Trina McLeod, in the late 1950s, she was just 12 years of age. For obvious reasons, Trina's family despised Ken and warned him to leave their daughter alone. Ken responded by driving over to the family home and executing their beloved foxhound with a single shell from his 12-gauge shotgun. When Trina's family held firm and attempted to keep their daughter safely out of Ken's reaches, he doubled down and set fire to their house in the middle of the night. Thankfully, Trina's family survived the arson attack, but they couldn't take any more. They finally relented and allowed Ken to date their underage daughter. Not long after, Trina came home and announced she would be dropping out of school. She was pregnant with Ken's child. A shotgun wedding was held soon after. After the child was born, Trina was so afraid of her new husband that she attempted to escape to her parents' house. Ken just showed up at their door, racked a shotgun, and told them that if he wasn't reunited with his wife, the dead dog in the arson attack would look like child's play. When Trina's parents once again surrendered her to Ken, he shot the house up anyway. Ken was separated from Trina all over again in 1973 when he was arrested for arson and assault. And for a man with no visible sign of income, he was able to get his hands on the $2,500 bail cash very, very quickly. Meanwhile, while Ken was locked up, Trina and the baby were placed in a foster home over in Maryville, just 14 miles away. The authorities were confident that they were finally safe from Ken's clutches, but somehow he tracked them down anyway. The foster family were puzzled to see a man camped outside their home in his car and reported that he just stared at their house all day until they finally went out to talk to him. But what he had to say absolutely horrified them. The man said his name was Ken Rex McElroy, and that the woman and child in their care were his. He told them that he could just walk up to their house, kill them both, and then walk out with what was his. Yet he claimed to be a reasonable man and proposed a trade. Girl for girl, McElroy supposedly said. When the foster asked him what he meant by that, Ken explained that he knew the name of their biological daughter, that he knew her school and the bus route she took to it. If he could get his girl back safe, they could get their girl back safe too. Trina was back living with Ken in a matter of days. The next few years were pretty quiet, evidence that Ken was trying to keep a low profile to avoid Trina and his child being taken away again. But on July 27, 1976, a farmer named Romaine Henry heard gunshots echoing around his property. He tracked down the source of the gunfire in his tractor, only to find a half-drunk Ken Rex partaking in some target practice with his 12-gauge. Romaine asked Ken Rex just what he thought he was doing, never once believing that Ken had it in him to turn the gun on a human being. But he was wrong. Ken turned on the spot, sized Romaine up, then let off a round of buckshot right at the cab of his tractor. The spray of lead chunks burst Romaine's belly open like a piñata, and as Ken left him bleeding to death and far from a telephone, Romaine was certain he was about to die. but by some miracle, a passing driver noticed the mortally wounded farmer slumped in his tractor seat and rushed to call the EMTs. Against all odds, Romaine Henry survived the attack, and despite Ken Rex denying he was even at the scene, he was arrested and charged with assault with attempt to kill. Everyone in town knew he was guilty, yet the lack of actual eyewitnesses meant further evidence would have to be gathered in order to properly seek a conviction. Romaine Henry later said that once he had recovered from his wounds and been discharged from the hospital, Ken Rex McElroy camped outside his home with a shotgun on his dash for 3 months. He stayed there every night, right up until the day of his trial, when Ken unveiled an unexpected alibi, 2 raccoon hunters he'd frightened into testifying on his behalf. What's more, Ken had somehow found the money to hire one of Kansas City's sleaziest but most accomplished defense attorneys, who discovered that Romaine had lied about a petty theft conviction from 30 years prior. To the shock and horror of everyone in Skidmore, the jury found McElroy not guilty, and he walked free that same day. McElroy's reign of terror continued for 5 more years, and the patience of Skidmore's residents began to reach breaking point. One incident saw Ken respond to an accusation of theft by driving into town with a World War II-era semi-automatic rifle. In front of a small crowd of gathered townsfolk, Ken attached a bayonet to the end of the rifle and threatened to butcher the next person who dared accuse his family of stealing. This was the straw that broke the camel's back. Perhaps it was seeing that bayonet, something purely made for war, that made the citizens of Skidmore realize that something had to be done about Ken Rex McElroy. But on the morning of July 10, 1981, a handful of townspeople gathered in Skidmore's Legion Hall to decide how to protect themselves from McElroy once and for all. Only right as this meeting is going on, who should roll down Main Street and park up in front of the small D&G Tavern but Ken Rex himself? Ken got out of his truck with his wife Trina, walked into the D&G, then sat smugly at a table while he ordered a beer. He was smug because he wasn't supposed to be there. The townspeople had warned him to keep away from Skidmore until the result of his court appeal, so Ken being there that day was an insult, an affront. And when word that Ken Rex was in town finally reached the Legion Hall, a chain of events was set in motion that could never be undone. By all accounts, Skidmore Sheriff Daniel Estes was everything you could wish for in a small-town police officer. He was a well-liked, well-respected Vietnam veteran who actually cared about the community and justice. So when Sheriff Estes is asked about what happened that morning, there's every reason to believe he's telling the truth. And according to him, when the Legion Hall meeting heard McElroy was in town and suggested confronting him, he strongly advised them not to do so. He instead suggested they form some kind of neighborhood watch program, one that could liaise with local police to ensure Ken's behavior was kept in track. But then, despite being faced with a potentially violent confrontation with a suspected attempted murderer, Sheriff Estes got into his police cruiser and drove out of town. Estes insists he was on an important police business, but others have suggested this was him giving the green light for what was to occur. With Skidmore's only sheriff now gone, those gathered in the Legion Hall gathered up their things and headed over to the D&G, where Ken Rex McElroy was still sat, sipping at the neck of a beer bottle. There was no immediate confrontation. Instead, the D&G began to slowly fill with customers, all keeping to themselves, all avoiding eye contact with the man who'd terrorized them for almost 30 years. Ken must have felt a smug satisfaction that morning. There he was, nursing a cold one, bold as brass, and no one had a thing to say about it. Ken finished his beer, took Trina by the arm, and walked her from the bar. But as he and his wife got into their truck, they noticed that many of the bar's occupants seemed to be leaving with them. In fact, they lined up behind Ken's truck, blocking him in as they stared him down. Then, as Ken started up his truck, a single shot rang out, smashing through the rear glass window of his truck and grazing the flesh of his neck. Ken must have let out a scream, something to alert those gathered behind him that the shot hadn't put him down, because what followed was a torrent of highly accurate gunfire that riddled McElroy but left his wife unscathed. Trina climbed out of the car, trembling and crying and stumbling towards the men who shot her husband to pieces. You killed him," she wailed, eyes wide with shock and disbelief. "We did," one of them replied. "Now get out of here, before we kill you too." But as you can imagine, Ken was hit several times, but the bullets that killed him were fired from one center-fire rifle and one .22 rimfire rifle. These are long rifles. A person can't just brandish one and have it gone unnoticed. But one of 46 potential witnesses, including Trina McElroy, not a single person was able to identify those that had fired their weapons that day. And it's also interesting to note that again, out of almost 50 people who'd heard or seen the shooting, not a single one called an ambulance. It was clear from the get-go that a homicide investigation conducted by local law enforcement was going to be problematic, and for a number of reasons. As a result, the case was quickly handed over to the state police, who promised a swift and unbiased resolution to Ken's killing. But they too came back empty-handed, citing tight-lipped townsfolk and a distinct air of vigilante intimidation. One Skidmore resident even brazenly told investigators that, although he didn't witness the incident, McElroy needed killing. 3 years after Ken's murder, with police having made no progress in catching his killer, Trina McElroy filed a $5 million wrongful death lawsuit against the town of Skidmore and a man named Del Clement. Trina accused Del of committing, and if not masterminding, what she described as the lynching of her husband, an innocent man who was murdered on a hunch by cowards who wouldn't own up to it. Skidmore Town Council met with Trina, who agreed to an out-of-court settlement of $17,600, but on the condition that the payment wouldn't imply guilt towards any party. Trina took the money and moved to Lebanon, Missouri, where she tried to leave a traumatic part of her life behind, while Skidmore residents were quick to assure outsiders that the settlement was made to avoid any costly legal fees that defending the accusation would incur. Others point to it as a clear sign of guilt. 17 grand to buy a man's life. 17 grand to make it all go away. It's almost been 40 years exactly since Ken Rex McElroy was executed by neighbors that he'd known all his life, and not a single person has been charged, tried, or convicted of his murder. What Ken Rex put the people of Skidmore through could frankly be described as hellish. He was violent, volatile, and he preyed on children. And when the once good and honest folks of Skidmore asked the law to protect them, the law failed them, spectacularly, on more than 20 different occasions. That's a terrifying concept, and I think we can all agree. It sounds like some kind of Kafkaesque nightmare detailing a crushingly inept state bureaucracy that allows monstrous crimes to go unpunished. But we could argue that there's another read of the McElroy murder, one that's considerably more frightening. And that's that the people around us, those we've known all our lives, could simply turn around and murder us in broad daylight before erecting a wall of silence so thick that it can enable a man to get away with murder. We're not held accountable by the law, we're held accountable by those around us, and either that's a very reassuring thought, or a distinctly terrifying one. The city of Baraboo is the largest city in Sauk County, Wisconsin, but with a population of little over 12,000 people, Baraboo has much more of a small-town vibe, especially in comparison with the much larger Madison or Milwaukee. Named after the nearby Baraboo River, the town is home to the awkwardly named Circus World Museum, a building which was once the home of the Ringling Brothers Circus. The circus founder, Al Ringling, is perhaps Baraboo's most famous former resident, and a handful of streets and landmarks still bear his name. But Baraboo is famous in other circles, for entirely different reasons. as the town was also the home of a young man whose horrifying crimes earned him the chilling nickname of the Bone Breaker. On the 4th of July 1994, 14-year-old Christopher Steiner's parents came home to find his bedroom empty. Chris didn't say he was planning on going anywhere, nor had he left a note explaining where he'd gone. His parents were only mildly concerned at first, but once they discovered muddy shoe prints that led from outside his bedroom window and into his room, they began to panic. Even an amateur detective could deduce that someone had walked up the muddy front path of the house, climbed the roof, then somehow gotten into Chris's bedroom. Police determined that the best-case scenario was that Chris had simply run away from home and would be back home shortly. Chris's parents denied he was the type to do that and refuted any suggestion that tensions at home were to blame. On the other hand, if there was some kind of hostile home invasion, Chris could have escaped the intruder before getting himself lost in the woods just outside of town. The horrifying alternative was that the intruder's goal wasn't to pilfer the family's valuables, but to take Chris himself as his prize. For each day that passed since their son's disappearance, Chris's parents' hope waned steadily. But even as they edged towards a grim acceptance of his fate, hearing the news that Chris's dead body had been found broke them. A member of the public has stumbled across his corpse, caught in some tree roots along a bank of the Wisconsin River. Chris was then transported for autopsy, with a coroner declaring that the cause of death clearly was drowning. However, the circumstances surrounding his death, be they accident or otherwise, remained a mystery. A huge part of the coroner's job is determining not just the cause of someone's death, but also the mechanism and manner of their death too. For example, the cause of death might be strangulation, but the mechanism details the physiology behind it, such as oxygen deprivation, whereas the manner of death tends to fall into one of 4 classifications: natural, accidental, them taking their own life, or homicidal. But in cases such as Chris Steiner's, the manner of death is considered undetermined. Some have stated that around 15% of deaths in the United States occur in a manner that is classed as undetermined. And so there exists a haunting void of knowledge surrounding their passing, a gap in a timeline, a lost hour, so that we might never understand just how their final moments on this earth came about. Perhaps just as tragic as it is terrifying, most cases of undetermined death simply turn cold and are filed away in some archive somewhere as an unsolved mystery. And this is exactly what happened with Chris's death. Although no one in his family could work out how he drowned, forensic investigators could detect no signs of foul play. So, since it wasn't listed as a homicide, there was no search for a killer, and the case was never solved. 1 year passes in Baraboo, and although Chris's death is not forgotten, the town's residents are finally beginning to coalesce with the circumstances of his passing remaining a mystery. Around 10 p.m. on the night of July 28, 1995, 13-year-old Baraboo middle schooler Thad Phillips went to bed after an exhausting day of school, but excited for the weekend to come. But as Thad was awoken later that night and groggily felt himself being picked up from the TV room couch, he assumed it was one of his parents taking him up to bed after he had fallen asleep in front of the television. Instead, the boy began to feel the cold night air on the skin of his cheeks. He was still half asleep when whoever was carrying him set the boy down on his feet before whispering 3 short words to him. "Run with me." Thad had no idea who it was, but in his confused and disoriented state, did as he was told, and it wasn't until he was fully awake and present at a rotten old 2-story home about a mile away that Thad realized he might have gotten himself in a whole lot of trouble. After getting a good look at the man he had run away with from home, it dawned on Thad that he'd never seen the man before in his life. When asked who he was, the man replied, "I'm Joe," before dragging young Thad into an upstairs bedroom. Before he could ask any more questions, Thad was pushed into a filthy, soiled mattress, after which Joe grabbed one of his feet and began to vigorously twist his ankle. Thad screamed so loud that distant neighbors a half-mile away later said they heard what sounded like a pig being slaughtered. Joe twisted and wrenched at the boy's ankle until it snapped and splintered, and both heard the sickening crunch of shattered bone ends grinding together. Yet somehow, imbued with the pure spirit of survival, the half-crippled Thad managed to fight his way out of Joe's grip and attempted to limp downstairs and out the door to freedom. But Joe was fast. He pushed Thad down the last third of the staircase, relishing the sickening thud and grunting expulsion of wind as the boy landed. Furious at the unexpected escape attempt, Joe approached the prostrate Thad, who was lying on his stomach on the splintered wooden floorboards. He took his left leg in his grip and forced his foot up towards his head, leaning in until Thad's femur snapped with a nauseating crack. The torturous abuse carried on long into the night, but bizarrely, once Joe seemed to be satisfied with the crippling agony he'd inflicted, he actually cleaned the boy's wounds, then patched up his broken leg with a crude mix of ace bandages, textile glue, and socks. And once he was certain that Thad was no longer a flight risk, Joe left his victim alone on the grubby, stained mattress and simply disappeared. But as it turned out, even having suffered the most horrific physical injuries, Thad Phillips was not ready to lay down and die. In an inspirational show of bravery and fortitude, young Thad found an old, heavy guitar and battered the bedroom door down with it. Crippled, dehydrated, and weakened, he then slowly and painfully dragged himself down the stairs, passing out repeatedly from pain and fatigue until he reached the kitchen phone. Thad managed to shake the cord until the receiver fell from the hook. He grabbed it and dialed 911, explaining the nightmare he had endured to a horrified police dispatcher, who promptly sent over the nearest police patrol unit. Officers quickly responded and rescued a terrified Thad before Joe could return to do more damage. By that time, he had been held prisoner and sporadically tortured for almost 2 days straight, and the wounds that Joe had inflicted resulted in fractures that would require several surgeries to fix, and even then, Thad was cursed to walk with a permanent limp. Using the detailed description given to them by Thad, police officers were able to track down the Joe that had kidnapped him. Joe turned out to be a 17-year-old high school student by the name of Joe Clark, and Thad claimed that during his torture sessions, his captor would boast of having done the exact same things to 2 other boys. The cops asked if Joe had dropped the names of any of these boys, and after a few moments of thought, Thad spoke. Chris. He said the kid's name was Chris. While one of the cops ran Chris's name through the missing persons database to see if there were any local matches, another team of police led an intensive search of Joe Clark's home, and what they discovered was truly horrifying. In Joe's bedroom was a notebook with 3 lists, all written in his handwriting that included the names of 18 local boys. Their headings were, Get to Now, Can Wait, and Leg Thing. These were apparently referencing the urgency with which he wanted to kidnap each victim and what he wanted to do with them once they were his prisoner. Only then did it become evident just how significant Thad's escape had been, because if he hadn't alerted law enforcement to Joe's terrifying kill list, there really is no telling how many victims Clark would have claimed. Police discovered that the pathologist who had examined Chris Steiner in the aftermath of his death had found no sign of injury. Nevertheless, the case had been mysterious and the body had been bloated from being in the water. The pathologist could have overlooked something. It was only then that police learned that no x-rays had been taken. There was only one way to discover whether Chris Steiner had been subjected to the same bizarre treatment that Thad had endured, and thus to link the 2 crimes to a single perpetrator. Police would have to exhume Chris Steiner's remains. In other words, they had to reopen his grave, remove the casket in which he lay, open it up, and remove the body for a closer examination. Once this was done, the forensic pathologist went over the small boy once again, and this time, armed with more information, he identified 4 separate breaks in Chris Steiner's legs. It was apparent that that boy had been thrown into the water in this condition. He could not have used his legs to swim and could easily have drowned. as he actually did. Coupled with the details of Thad's torture and Joe's apparent penchant for crippling his victims, the conclusion was obvious. Joe Clark first appeared in court over his attack on Thad Phillips and entered a plea of no contest to attempted homicide, among other charges. He was sentenced to a 100-year prison term, but claims to have no recollection of the Thad Phillips abduction and torture. However, the Chris Steiner case was a different story, and Joe pled not guilty, though an exhumation of Steiner's body had revealed that the sustained injuries to his ankles were identical to those Thad suffered. Joe Clark's parents' testimony that their son was home asleep in his room on the night of the killing did not line up with other witnesses, who claimed Clark regularly snuck out of the house via an upstairs window. So on November 7th of 1997, Joe Clark was found guilty of homicide, then sentenced to life in prison, plus 50 years. Yet he still maintains his innocence in Chris Steiner's murder to this day. We can only conclude that a violent young man was confronted with what a monster he was, and simply couldn't handle it. And evidently, neither could his mother. But neither point matters, because the bottom line is that Joe Clark, the bone breaker, will likely die in prison in a peaceful, painless manner that he so cruelly robbed his victims of. I grew up in a small town in North Wales, which will remain nameless for reasons that'll become obvious. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business, and since there was little in the way of entertainment, gossiping became a lot of people's hobby of choice. Whether it was in the supermarkets, the pubs, the kids' playgrounds, or the rugby stands, people never missed an opportunity to divulge each other's deepest, darkest secrets. And just before I left for university in 2006, the most sensational and most poorly kept secret was that a teenage lad, that we'll call Reese to protect the innocent, was clinically depressed and had started hurting himself. I'd seen Reese around town a few times, long hair obscuring his face, wearing long-sleeved t-shirts in the summertime. All the old biddies would shake their heads and tut whatever they saw him trudging through town. They'd say, "Oh, there he goes, off to buy drugs or razor blades or what have you." But I only saw him going in and out of the guitar shop. Then, on the day in question, Wales were playing New Zealand in the rugby, so one of our neighbors had put up a marquee in their back garden that was complete with a projector. The idea being that anyone not going to the two pubs in town could congregate at his place, having a drink and watch the Dragons. I didn't really care about the rugby at the time, still don't really, so I had to hear this from my sister. But during halftime, that Reese boy's dad popped home for some reason, then rushed back to tell his wife that he thought Reese was trying to take his own life. His room was locked, and no one was responding whenever they knocked. Reese's dad had tried to kick the door down, but he wasn't exactly a giant or anything, so he'd rushed back to the party for help. Just about everyone at the party immediately rushed around to Reese's parents' house, and the blokes helped bash the door down to find that, whoops, no one was there. In his Carling-induced haze, Reese's dad hadn't thought to check his bedroom window, which a grounded Reese had used to escape his bedroom so he could go hang out with his friends or something. But they didn't know that at the time, and everyone still was in a bit of a panic. And I mean everyone. Because like I said, 90% of the people left the party to help possibly save Reese's life. Even the homeowners had ran out after telling their 12-year-old son to keep an eye on the baby. They'd only be gone for a couple of minutes, and their son wouldn't possibly hurt his baby sister, would he? From what I heard, when the 12-year-old's parents arrived home about a half hour later, the mum screamed so loud and so long that she fainted and just about cracked her head open on a sideboard. While they were gone, their son, who I'm assuming was a few sticks short of a bundle, had spilled some of his juice on his baby sister and couldn't find any paper towels to dry her off. Instead of using absolutely anything at hand to just wipe his sister off, the kid took it upon himself to put his baby sister in the microwave before turning it on for a couple of minutes. People have tried to say they heard or saw how bad the scene was, and I've heard some seriously graphic descriptions in my time, but I don't think anything could really touch on the pure horror of walking in on something like that. A lot has been made of the kid's intentions too. Since he was 12, not some toddler, some people argued that he knew exactly what he was doing, and the trying to dry her off story was the family's way of clawing back some small shred of decency, pretending it was all just a horrible accident, when in actual fact, it was something considerably darker. Yet I know this sounds grim, but between you and me, if you knew the kid that had done it, you might not even be surprised. Not evil by any stretch of the imagination, but not all there either. I think the most shocking thing for me, though, is how rumors about Reese had people literally running all over town, trying to find him, trying to kick down his door, blah blah blah, when really, the biggest threat to anyone's safety was this seemingly harmless and perfectly innocent young lad who just shouldn't have been left alone by his mom and dad. They moved him into a psychiatric home for juveniles not long after, and by the following year, his family had moved over to England, I assume to get away from the memory of it. I feel for them, I really do, but the thought of that little girl getting cooked in that bloody microwave makes my skin crawl, even today. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. If you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit, r/Let'sReadOfficial, and give and receive feedback from the community, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And join a live stream to catch an invite to my Discord. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations for just $1 a month on Patreon, and maybe even pick up some Let's Read merch on Spreadshirt. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all these stories in long compilation form and save huge on data, located anywhere you listen to podcasts. Links in the bio. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, it's probably just a nacho.